All right, so let us review the temperature conversion application. So let's just look at what I've got locally on my machine here. So just like before, I've created another branch for this application. On the solution branch is where you can see my instructor's suggested solution. Not that this is the only way or the best way, but it's pretty minimal, checks all the boxes. I think it's pretty nice. Since there was so much starter code for this exercise, and we're basically just converting from one version of this application to another version of the same application, I thought git diff would be an easy way to talk through my changes, because it'll show us, the two different versions of the application. First, though, let's run this, make sure that it is actually like working successfully before I walk you through broken code. So we'll run npm start to start up our dev server. All right. Okay, so first thing, I'm getting this unauthorized error because I took out my open weather API key. That was just so I could like push this up to GitHub, because GitHub's going to freak out at you if you have API keys in your code. So let me grab that real quick. The handy dandy link from our repo here. Grab my API key and then paste it in. All right, so let's try this one more time. Okay, so now I'm getting a different error. Does anyone want to take a stab at why I was getting a 401 before and now I'm getting a 400? Just what are the difference between those two error codes and why is that happening? Might be some clues if you look at this URL itself that failed. Any ideas?
Is it a bad key?
Which key is bad?
There's more than one.
Zip,
Is it-
zip,
is it-
zip. Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Lyman.
I was just saying zip.
Yeah. So here in the data that we're sending to the Open Weather API, zip equals and then empty string. So it looks like I'm trying to tell it a zip code, but then there's no actual data here, just comma, and then it goes on to the next thing. So the Open Weather API doesn't know what to do with that. This is a bad request. And that's because just on the page load, it's already trying to request the temperature based on whatever is in this input box. And currently there's nothing typed in there. So that's why zip is just empty string. So if I actually try to type in a real zip code, 60654, this is River North, where I live, not far from the school. So there, we're actually able to get the current temperature, displays in nice big letters in both Celsius and Fahrenheit. So yeah, this isn't really like a huge show-stopping issue. We're gonna automatically get this error once when the page loads, but the app recovers from it. And then subsequent requests will work properly when users are actually typing into the input. So that's the functionality in my application. Seems like it's working well enough. Don't need that hash URL there. Let's see. This is more where I grew up in the northern suburbs of Chicago. All right, so let's look at the code, see what I actually did. So let's see here. This terminal is running the app, so we'll make a new terminal tab. So I'm on my solution branch, and we also have a master branch. So I want to compare them. Git diff master. Except I don't actually want to diff the package lock JSON. So we're going to be a little more specific. Git diff master src. I only want to get a diff for files in the source directory. Those are the only ones that I'm interested in right now. Okay, so first off, it's comparing the app.js in the two different commits that I'm comparing. So let's go there first. Here we are in the app.js. So first thing that we needed to change was instead of import component from React, we're importing useState useEffect. So we no longer have to use the component function, the component class in React to create our components. Using the functional style in React, we just use plain functions for defining our components. So just, function app. So I kind of like that. It seems a little cleaner. Don't have to just import something in every file. It's just kind of extra boilerplate that I don't have to write this way. Although on the flip side, there is extra boilerplate because now I need to import useState and useEffect. Now, previously, the state would have just been on this in the class, so I wouldn't have had to import it. But now, just the way that the React hooks split things up with the functional components, these are now separate features that I need to import. They're not part of the class anymore. So yeah, I changed the API key. Yeah, to include my actual API key instead of your API key here. When we define the component itself, like I was saying, it's no longer a class that inherits from component. We just create a plain function and then React knows what to do with it. So in the class-based version, we have this state object as a class variable or as an instance variable for our component. And that's the class-based style. So instead, we're going to be using the useState hook. And instead of declaring a single object, I decide to use multiple different state variables. So we've got temperature and set temperature, which defaults to null, just like we're seeing here. And then zip code, set zip code defaults to an empty string, which is what we've got here. So we've translated this state object into two individual state variables using hooks. So I've changed this get temperature function. Instead of being an instance method of a class, it's just a regular function that we're defining inside of another function. So in some ways, that's a little bit simpler. Put the actual API key into the URL using our variable interpolation with the backtick strings. Then we have to look at all the places where we're setting state. So instead of this.set state, the analogous feature would be just using our setters from useState. So set temperature instead of this.set state with the temperature key. That's kind of how we make that conversion. All right. So now we're getting into replacing the lifecycle hooks in the app.js with our useEffect. So let's see here. Previously, we had component did update, looking at the previous props, previous state. And we're comparing if previous state zip code is different from the current state zip code? And if so, we will get temperature. Because this whole function component did update, this runs for any update to this component. But in this case in particular, I don't want to run get temperature for any update to the component. I only want to do this when the zip code changes. So that's why we're manually checking the state zip code, the previous state zip code versus the current state zip code to see if there are any changes. But with the use effect hook, it's a little bit less manual logic. You're not manually comparing the previous with the current. You just kind of declare in this dependency array that this is the thing that our use effect depends on. When this changes, run this function again. So every time the zip code changes, because the user types something into the input, in that case, we will run get temperature. And this also runs when the component loads initially, but for any other updates to other state variables, which I guess in this case would just be temperature, because there's just temperature and zip code. So if temperature changes, we're not going to get temperature, which is good because that would just be an infinite loop. So again, we've got a little helper function here. We're going to convert it from, convert it from using set state to using our setter that we got from useState. So that's the same kind of transformation we've been doing here. So yeah, instead of passing in this object with the new zip code, we're just setting the actual zip code itself, but using our zip code setter. And then lastly, for the render method, instead of defining a class with a render method, well, I guess this is actually different because this is a helper method. This isn't the actual render method. So the difference is here is we're not accessing state. All of our state variables are just right in the local scope. So zip code instead of this state zip code, temperature instead of this state temperature. Again, temperature instead of this state temperature. And then here, this last difference, instead of defining a render method, which returns JSX, we just return JSX. So it's really just deleting this first line, deleting this last line here, and then unindenting this part in the middle. So that was really the only change that happened here. So all the logic is correct to begin with. It's just kind of the syntax and the format. All right, so those were all the changes I had to make to the app.js. We can continue this conversation now, looking through the error display.js. But if anyone has any questions just about the changes I've made to app.js, this would be a fine time to ask them. All right, so at this point, we're going to see a lot of the same changes, honestly, because the app.js is just going to be bigger, more complicated than a lot of the other components. So they're going to have basically the same features, but just less of them. So again, we're not importing component, but we do need use effect here to replace our lifecycle methods using a function instead of a class. Now here, we're going to replace a different lifecycle method. Instead of component did mount, we're using a use effect, but with an empty array passed in. So that means that this isn't going to run for every component update, but only when the component mounts initially, which is great because we're trying to replace a component did mount. Now things get a little bit weirder here as we're trying to replace this component will unmount. So I'm not going to create a second use effect here, because remember the way that we handle the component unmounting with use effect is by returning a function from use effect. So I think this syntax is really bizarre. it doesn't like do what it says it does. You have to just read the documentation and know how this works. But this is how it works. Because I'm returning this function from useEffect, this is how I tell React that this is the function that needs to run right before the component leaves the page. And again, we replace the render method with just a simple return statement from our function that has our JSX. And then props are no longer a property on this because we're not using a class anymore. Props are just an argument that's passed into the component function. So I just access them like a local variable. All right, now in the input zip code JS, still similar changes. This might be getting kind of repetitive at this point. We're not importing component. We are not using the class syntax. We're just making a regular function. It's going to take props. And so instead of formatting our functions like class methods, we're just writing a plain function assigned to a variable, const handle zip code. So we don't have a class. We're not using this. Props are just a local variable. Instead of this.props, we've just got props. And again, we're just returning JSX instead of defining a render function that returns JSX. So this was probably the simplest component here so far. But let's look at the temperature display here, which might be a little bit more interesting. So again, not importing component, but we are importing useState and useEffect. Not using the class syntax. We are using function syntax. It gets props passed in. So we don't have our state instance variable because this isn't a class. And instead, I'm going to set up that same state using two state variables using useState. Temp and Celsius, temp and Fahrenheit, both get initialized to null. So this is the same behavior here. Now, let's see here. So again, changing the function syntax, just be a plain function instead of a instance method. Not using set state anymore because we're using our setter functions. Also not using component did mount anymore. Where's the actual useEffect though? There we go. Okay, so you can also see component did update was deleted. So just note that we've deleted two of the class-based lifecycle methods, component did update and component did mount. And we've replaced them with a single useEffect. And this only depends on temp and Kelvin. So the reason why I was able to replace both of those lifecycle methods with just this one is because useEffect will also run when the component mounts. So I've specified this dependency array saying that we should rerun update temp values every time props.temp and Kelvin changes. But this also counts as a change when it's set initially when the component loads in the first place. So you don't need a second useEffect to handle when the component loads if you already have a useEffect that handles a certain prop changing, because that useEffect, this useEffect will run when the component loads initially. So it's kind of redundant to have a second useEffect. And then lastly, we return the JSX instead of just having our render function. And that's the end of the git diff. So
Raphael, would you say that you only need the the second use effect to differentiate the did mount and did update if you only want something to happen on the mount and not on the update? When would you want to separate them?
Right. I think you got it right, but I'm gonna talk about this for a minute.
Mhm.
Well, let's look at this diff again. So in the previous version, so we have our component did update, which depends on temp and Kelvin. But what do we do if the temp and Kelvin actually changed? All we do is update temp values. Now, if we look at component did mount, what do we do when the component mounts? Oh, what do you know? It's the exact same thing. We just update temp values. So using the class-based components, I don't believe that component did update runs when the component mounts initially. Maybe it does actually, I might be mistaken. But at any rate, since both of these trigger for this, or both of these do the same thing when they trigger, I was perfectly comfortable just putting them in one use effect. But if they did different things, then I would have to handle this differently. So if on component did mount, we had some extra functionality we wanted to run or something completely different, then I would need to use two different use effects. I would have one use effect with an empty dependency array that would just run when the component mounts. And then I would need another use effect with props.temp and Kelvin, which would run when the temp and Kelvin property changes. So yeah, it just depends.
Yeah. I get a warning when I don't include the function that we call like update temp values in my dependency array. Seems to work fine without doing that, but
it does. I think this is kind of a strange warning that React gives, but so here's why they're giving it. So I've got this use effect here. When we call it, it's going to update temp values. It calls this function. Now I'm telling React that the output of this use effect, the result of this use effect depends on props.temp and Kelvin. React only knows that because I'm telling it explicitly, but clearly, obviously, the result of use effect also depends on the definition of update temp values. Like if I replaced this function with a completely different function, then like obviously this use effect is going to do something different. You know what I'm saying? Because it just calls this function, whatever has this name, it gets called in our use effect. So if we replace this function with a different function, like we've changed the effect, and React would think like, oh, I should rerun it because it does something different now. People see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so technically we could change the definition of that function variable.
Right.
Yeah.
Which that would be kind of a weird way to write your code.
Definitely.
But like if you did that, just based on some Boolean logic, this update temp values has a different value on different component renders. Then yeah, it would make sense that you'd say like, yeah, we should rerun this use effect if we reassign a different function to this variable. So that kind of makes sense in a certain way. And like, in fact, every time this component renders, this is a different function because we're defining it right here. Now, never mind, it's the same function every time we define it, but from React's perspective, it gets a different function with the same name every time this component renders. So as far as React is able to determine automatically, this use effect does depend on some other value, some other variable that you have not included in the dependency array. Just anything that you explicitly mention inside the use effect, React has got to assume that, yeah, this use effect depends on that variable because you're mentioning it in the effect. Like obviously if that variable changes, the effect is going to do something different. So React is trying to be helpful. It's just like, this is not how I want to write my code. Like I'm never going to reassign this function to a different function with the same name. That's just weird. I would make a different function with a different name if I needed some different functionality. I guess there are some circumstances where you would reassign a function because like you know that some type of work needs to be done, but you're not exactly sure about the specifics. And so you can like reassign the specifics later. But that's not what we're doing here. So yeah, React is trying a little bit too hard to be useful and is maybe making some mistaken assumptions about what we're intending for our code to do. So I've definitely seen those warnings pop up. I think trying to refactor your code to satisfy the React warnings might end up making your code look even worse. So I don't really know what to tell you. You might just want to get comfortable with those warnings. You can suppress them. There might be a better way I can organize my React code so it doesn't warn me about those and they're not generated at all, but I'm not exactly sure how to go about that. That was probably more than you were asking for, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Cool. What other questions do we have about converting class-based components to functional components or use effect or life cycles?
So in like modern React apps, after the introduction of hooks, like, are there really like many practical use cases? Like if you're using modern versions of React to like be using class-based components, or is it like pretty much all functional from this point?
I'll put it this way. I cannot think of a specific business problem that would make me think this would be best solved with class components instead of functional components. I think the decision to use one over the other depends on your like existing skills and expertise, you know, the skills and expertise of your team, the existing infrastructure that your company already has. You know, like if 99% of the app is in class components, I wouldn't be the first person or the second person to add a functional component. So yeah, there are a variety of considerations I would consider to choose functional components over class components, but none of them are the inherent merits of functional versus class components. Like the bigger issue is just the community and where you're working, really.
Got it. Thanks.
Mhm.
Oh, can I ask, so like in practice, do you find that the way we might encounter this as developers is like translating older code to functional components?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, the intention of this exercise is just to get you to understand both of them and know how they relate to each other, because you might see tutorials with class-based and you might have to translate that in your head into functional-based components. But for sure, you are right that like, this is the kind of work that a company might need to do, as you know, they built a huge application in class components and then they decide they need to modernize and they're going to refactor to functional components. Is also the kind of work that a senior developer will not want to do, because like, let's be real, this is kind of tedious. You know, I did this for one tiny app with 4 components and it wasn't too bad, but if I was assigned to do this for like a whole sprint, I would probably hate myself. But like if you're a junior developer, and especially if you're new to the project itself, this can be a pretty good low stakes way to like get acquainted with the project, because you're not adding new functionality and like everybody knows what the components are supposed to do. They already have tests written for them in theory, ideally. So you're just refactoring them to different syntax. But in the process of doing that, you get to look at a lot of the company's code and kind of see what their existing logic is and, you know, engage with it a little bit in kind of a limited, low risk way. So that would be, I think, a good task to assign to a junior developer, is just asking them to convert all of the class-based components to functional components.
Cool, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. What other questions do we have? Just seeing if I'm missing anything good from the chat. Does anyone want to talk about some VS Code extensions that they're using for Git? I know I'm very command line focused. I don't usually look for Git extensions, but if other people are finding these useful, you want to share about them? Because I think that this diff is very legible, but I know that there are better ways that you can visually represent it if you go looking for those kinds of tools.
Yeah, I mean, I know a couple people were showing some love for GitLens. I like it. It's just left and right. So it'll just do like a split screen
Mhm.
and then it'll be like red and green. So it's really not much different. It's just it'll pull that up automatically.
Okay. I
Yeah.
mean, in my opinion, getting the split screen would be a pretty big improvement instead of just seeing the red and green like on top of each other. So I've never actually seen it before. Would you want to share your screen real quick? Just show us what it looks like, how you use it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Yeah, so this concludes my temperature conversion app demo. Hope you all liked it. Thanks for being engaged, asking questions. And so now let's check out GitLens.
This could take a second if you want to pull something else up.
And Raphael, I'll walk you through what you had for yours. I'm gonna bring your code back up again.
I'm sorry, what did you want to walk us through?
So just go into your files. You just right click on one of them you want to see the history for. And just go to open timeline. And then you can click on the timeline down there to see the diffs in browser or in editor.
Ooh. So what is this comparing though?
What do you have now versus the last commit or save?
Yep. So that's cool. How can I make this more flexible to compare just like anything to anything?
Well, this is just the baseline when it comes to VS Code. I'm pretty sure there's another extension out there to make it funkier. I use Webstorm myself, so.
Okay, you're not using VS Code at all?
No, I do for the class, but and like when I'm working on pet projects, I use paid IDEs.
Okay, interesting. Do you feel like you could use Webstorm for the class? Like, is it well suited to this kind of development? I've never used it before.
I can't. I just don't want to have anyone confused if we have to screen share or anything, so they're not familiar with it.
Okay. That's kind, I appreciate it. But like, if you weren't taking this class, you would probably prefer, like if you were just hired as a Django React developer, you would prefer to do your work in Webstorm?
Prefer, but it just depends on what tools they require. So
Does. It's very useful to be on the same page as your employer and your team. I just think it's interesting. I haven't seen anyone use it in a while, ever. I'm not sure. Yeah, this is really cool. I definitely prefer having the side-by-side diff. And I guess in this case, because I did my whole solution in one commit, this actually does show me pretty useful output. But generally, the real power of git commit or git diff is that you can just name two commits or two branches, or one branch versus your current branch or whatever, and then git diff can compare anything to anything. So you can compare like, what have I just done recently that I haven't committed yet? What's the difference between this commit and my last commit? The difference between this branch and the other branch? What's the difference between my local version of the code and my coworker's version of the code that I'm about to merge in? Just anything you need to compare, you can compare two commits with Git. And I'm sure that VS Code has some similar functionality. It probably just is not like one click away in the GUI here. So I'll have to figure that out. But definitely thanks for sharing this timeline feature with me, John. I always like learning more about my editor and just the features available to me.
Yeah, honestly, that's pretty much the same as GitLens, just without like certain little tooltips that'll come up in like the timeline, where
Mhm.
it'll basically show like the commit messages, and another tooltip with like times, and it's like the same thing, but like a little bit more detailed.
Okay. I mean, do you want to bring it up right now if you got it, or is that gonna
Yeah,
take-
sure, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
You stop sharing first though.
Oh, right, sorry. Just hogging the screen here.
So yeah, I mean the only difference is you get these like little tooltips with like just buttons. It'll show you like the ID for the commit, and who changed, what time they changed it. But
Mhm.
other than that, like the actual history here is more or less the same.
Okay.
So not big differences. I think probably the nice thing about GitLens is that like when you're actually in the code, it'll show like commits also in line. So right
Mhm.
next to the code. So just if you're working like as part of a team, like we aren't usually doing here for our assignments, but like when we were doing pair programming or something, you could see, somebody changed something, or if somebody did a commit at some other point, and you can see it there without having to pull up the history.
Mhm. So honestly, I kind of really like the inline commit history about like the last edited information. I haven't set up my editor to do that, but I think, the next time I find myself on a team with other developers, that's certainly something I would want to add to my editor. I've seen other people do it and it seems like it's really effective. Just generally working on a team, especially working on an older code base, it can be really frustrating if you find a piece of code and you just don't know why it is the way it is. Like sometimes it just looks really bizarre. It's a really like inefficient way to solve the problem. But you've got to wonder, like, maybe the person who wrote that like knows something that I don't. Maybe it was like a super smart senior engineer and they're considering something I'm not considering. So it can be really useful to just have that like commit information next to you. So you can see like, oh, this code was written like 3 weeks ago by our intern. Like maybe they just don't exactly know what's up, and I'll like talk to them and maybe they had some misunderstanding and we'll fix it. Or the commit message might show you that that line of code was written 5 years ago by like the co-founder of the company who's not there anymore. So maybe it's just like super important and like very like arcane smart code that you wouldn't understand, but like the founder knew it had to be that way, and so he wrote it like that. Just generally, I feel like knowing the history of a line of code tells you a lot about like why it is the way it is and whether or not you should change it. Like especially if your boss wrote a particular line of code, you might be hesitant to change it during like a PR you're making.
If we have time, I'll do a little screen share of Webstorm to show you its Git functionality, making things more user friendly.
Um, Yeah, we got a little bit of time. I want to stop before 10, but can you show us a little bit about your IDE? I always like just knowing different ways to do things. VS Code is maybe like the 7th editor I've used in my career. It's probably not going to be the last. So I just like knowing what's out there. All right, so you've got a lot of windows here.
So
Right.
yeah, I was hitting space bar trying to speak, but I wasn't focused on the Zoom, so I had to move things around.
Yep.
So yeah, the bottom bar is just all the Git history. So here I can see all the merges and everything else deconflicting. I can see them all side by side as necessary. I've got a super wide, so I can actually break these out if I want to different windows, although I can't show you on Zoom at the moment. But I can just go to each one and see all the differences that were changed, what was taken out, what was added. Same thing as before. If I want to do it specifically on a file, it's the same thing, or a folder. Go into the Git, you can show the entire history for that one. That one only had one thing though. Let's see here. I think the index would be the best one. For here, let's see here. Show history. Yeah, that's basically where it was. And it gives you a little graphical interface. This one's not a great example. Writer's got the bigger project, which has a lot more branches to it.
Mhm.
But it makes it easier to kind of, after I've gotten a bunch of different features I've tinkered with on pulling them back into the main branch. So I can compare and select from within here, that basically accept, reject from within here.
Very cool.
Yeah, but that was a little 2-minute.
Yeah. So you did the show history real quick. There was the branches section in the Git menu, I think.
Right. Oop, try this again. So far as looking at them or making them?
Looking at them.
Well, there's no current branches because they've all been pulled back in.
Okay. Can you
But if I
compare
wanted
them
to, I
here?
could create a new branch. I'll go put a space in here and I thought I selected. So now whenever I do this, it should show the branch. Let's see. No, it doesn't. Like I said, this isn't the best. This is just a simple website, so it doesn't really have much to it. But let's see here. And it's not going to show the history either. So, and the other thing is you can do between saves. So say you haven't actually pushed a commit, you can actually go between the auto saves on what changed. That way, if you ran yourself into a wall, you don't have to necessarily rely on a commit to kind of get back in history.
Okay, that's nice.
But yeah, I don't know why it's not letting me. So I'm checked out to the branch. I don't know why it's not showing it on here. Maybe I have to commit another one. Commit anyway. Oh, I must be having issues with my commit. So I have this folder symlink, just probably having issues because of that. But yeah, I mean, it's a valuable tool whenever I'm in dev mode for it.
Very cool. So like in my mind, like I haven't really even heard of Webstorm in 10 years, but in my mind, Webstorm is mostly like for PHP development. Would you say that's wrong? That this
No,
is like,
it's all for the front end aspect. So if I wanted to actually let me bring it up here. I don't have to let me do the next one. Front end, this window. All right, is it still showing everything on there?
yep, I'm looking at
All
some
right, so
deals.
yeah, for React as well. So building your React front end, you can do it all from within here. And you get the benefits of the IntelliSense from it. So when I'm doing a div, it'll give me the most common ones on here, so it's less typing.
Oh, but then you gotta use your mouse
No,
or the arrow keys or something.
well, you just have to type. You put in,
Okay,
and you just keep on going.
cool.
It's just little quality of life features compared to the VS Code.
So you wouldn't use this for like backend development, like Django or nothing?
No, I have PyCharm for Django. So IntelliJ, I have their enterprise suite. So it's got all the stuff for the different things. So one thing for C# and .NET, another one for Python, another one for front end.
So what if
or
you were,
React.
what if you were developing an application that had both React code and Django code in it?
Then I would have Webstorm for the front end and then PyCharm for the back end, which is what I'm doing right now.
I mean, yeah, I guess you could open it in two editors. I hadn't considered that. Okay, I have one last question. This is very important. Can you increase the font size here?
Oh, well. I gotta remember how to do it within this. It's not the same keystrokes. I'd have to go look that one up.
It's not just like Command plus or nothing.
Or
Control
control and the
plus.
scroll wheel.
No, it's not the same bindings for it. Increase font size. Let me see if there's a quick Control Alt S. And then font size. Oh, that's not the right one.
Looks like everything except for the font size got bigger.
There. I did it for the editor, not the actual pane. That a bit better?
Yeah. I was just curious because one of my biggest frustrations with VS Code is that when you just hit Command plus, like the really quick keyboard shortcut, just make everything bigger, it makes the text larger, but it also makes everything larger. So like the scroll wheel is thicker, the sidebar is thicker, all the like top and bottom, like header and footer bars, those get thicker too. So like as you increase the font size, there's actually much less space for the actual text in the middle of the screen, as like all the UI just takes up way more space. So like generally, I feel like I have a harder time reading code than some other developers. So, you know, I like to make the font size larger and I do other kind of visual tricks to make things easier to read. But I find that VS Code just becomes unusable after you increase the font size like 1 or 2 ticks above normal, because just like the scroll bars are taking up a third of the page. So I was just hoping that there's a way we could increase the font size here without increasing the rest of the UI.
Yeah,
And
so
I'm gonna
I put all the editor stuff back into its original size.
Mhm.
Now just the font is larger for the editor pane.
Okay, that's amazing. You've persuaded me. I'm going to switch to WebStorm now.
Again, it's all about the settings. I don't claim to be an expert for it, so.
There's always more to learn.
Mhm.
All right.